Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Hachette Australia and the Tandem Collective. It's been a few years and a few books with lots of exciting developments since I last chatted with my next guest author. However, with a whopping 7 books under his belt now, 2 of those already adapted for screen, this author's star is absolutely booming. With each of his books, he delights and thrills, earning his place as one of Australia's most exciting literary talents. I am, of course, talking about JP Pomare. JP is a best-selling, award-winning author originally from New Zealand and who now lives in Australia. His first novel, Me Evie, published in 2018, won the Ngaio Marsh Award for Best First Novel, while Tell Me Lies, his third novel, became a #1 Audible bestseller and was shortlisted for the Ngaio Marsh Best Crime Novel Award, along with the Ned Kelly Award for Best Crime Fiction. This month, JP's brand new novel, 17 Years Later, will hit shelves across Australia and New Zealand. And listeners, what a novel it is. Published by Hachette Australia, 17 Years Later sets a cracking pace with lots of twists and turns. An enthralling, nail-biting, propulsive read that will leave you reeling with an ending you didn't see coming. I'm truly excited to welcome JP back for a chat about his novel today. Hi, JP.
Hello, thanks so much for having me back on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And formally, congratulations on the release of 17 Years Later. How are you feeling about it?
Really good, actually. Yeah, I mean, I'm always quite critical of my stuff when it comes out, I guess, because you're just sort of talking about it so much and thinking about it, and you're probably much more cognizant of the weaknesses, I suppose, of certain stories and reviews, and you just very much get over it. But I'm not at all with this book for some reason. I really love it, and I think it's been received exceptionally well, which I'm grateful for. So it's been lovely.
JP, with 7 books out in the space of 6 years, along with 2 Audible originals, a phenomenal output by anyone's standards, I wanted to ask you how long it takes you to write a book.
I would say probably, honestly, when you say 7 books in 6 years, the 2 of those were the novellas I wrote for Audible. They're a bit shorter. I've knocked those ones out in probably 6 months, to be honest with you, maybe less. They've been quick. I would also say I wrote Evie over sort of 2 or 3 years, maybe perhaps a little longer. And then when I got a publishing deal, I started in the clearing. And so that was a couple of years before I handed that one in. So Evie and In the Clearing probably took 3 and 2 years. So really it's probably been 5 full-length novels and 2 novellas over about 10 years. So it's slightly less, impressive. But really, I'd say it takes as long as it takes. And I know that's such a horribly imprecise answer. And I think people want a concrete time frame because especially if you're an aspiring author, you want to know, do I need to work on it for a year or 5 years? I would say this book took probably 2.5 years to 3 years to write. And I wasn't writing it the entire time, but I certainly started at the middle of 2020. And I've worked on other projects in the interim, but this one took a while. But other books, I'd say on average, probably take about a year and a half from conception of the idea to completion of the entire editorial suite. I think that's probably about right, about a year and a half. And my next book's out exactly 18 months after this one. So I think around March 2026.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, you talked about this novel taking you about 2.5 to 3 years and you were working on other projects in the interim. Is that normal for you?
I've always got 2, I'd say a minimum 2 things going at once. I think that's because I like it. I like working that way. But you can't work on something constantly because there are editorial cycles in which you're waiting sometimes up to 3 or 4 months to get the notes back. And I'm not just going to sit there for 3 or 4 months doing nothing. Although last year I probably did do that because I took a year off. But generally I'll have 2 or 3 things going at once, even if it's the very nascent kind of embryonic ideation stage of a novel. I'll just be jotting down ideas or trying to capture voice. So I might write the first chapter and just see how the voice is working. All that sort of stuff. I'm happy to do that between editorial cycles. And because I write a bit for Audible, as you know, that's a factor too. Those things are usually about 40 to 50,000 words, maybe a little bit longer these days. But when you're doing that, I can write a full draft in a 2-month gap between sending off a draft to my publisher and waiting for, say, a structural edit to come back, I can knock out a full draft. It's maybe not for everyone working this way, but it really works for me.
When you first conceived of the idea to write 17 years later, did you know where it would go, or did you start with the idea and just run with it and let your characters have some part to play in how it turned out?
My response to questions such as this is always the same, that I write with a compass instead of a map. So I never fully plot, but I also have an idea of where I'm kind of walking, the direction. And as long as I end up, say north, I'm happy. In saying that, I probably know where it ends quite often, but I have no idea what happens in between. I might have one or two plot points, one or two scenes often in mind that I think would be really kind of important in capturing the theme of the story. So in this case, for those who've read 17 years later, the scenes I definitely had in mind was being sort of pressured to perform a haka. That was one of the scenes that I had probably before I had even characters. I think even some of the scenes where he's cooking and some of the food he was cooking, he's a private chef. So, some of the scenes where he's cooking, I really wanted to have in there. So I've got little waypoints, I suppose, and the ending, but generally I let the characters go wherever they want to go. And I like to try to write as though I'm just following them with a camera and seeing what they do. But if you do that too much, and if you don't do any plotting, then it becomes, terribly tedious to edit and also to read. If you don't edit it enough, it's going to take you a long time to get it refined and to have enough content to have an interesting story. But at the same time, you still risk a really boring story. So I'm not a pantser or a plotter. I'm sort of a combination of the two.
This story is anything but boring, so we can move that issue aside. But for the benefit of those who haven't yet read it, JP, I was wondering if you could tell us more about the story.
Yeah, of course. So the story is about a private chef by the name of Bill Kadiyama. He is employed by a wealthy expat British family in a small town called Cambridge in New Zealand. They live in a bit of a mansion, and Bill's from a working class, probably rougher background, but he's a bit of a prodigy and a real gun in the kitchen. So he works quite hard and becomes a private chef for this family. Then after he is fired, and I won't go into details of why, he's fired by the family. A day later, the family are all found stabbed, and he's charged with the murders. Instantly arrested, a really short investigation. After 17 years, a firebrand podcast by the name of Sloane Abbott. Sloane, I describe for those in the podcast world, as like Hedley Thomas, who did Teacher's Pet. Like Hedley Thomas, but young, hot and single. And she's a real firebrand, but has that same, I think Hedley's such a brilliant investigative journalist because he's really dogged, driven largely by his own sense of morality, I think, which I would say definitely Sloane is conscious of her own moral compass, but also adheres to some ethics. But I think what's important for her is morality. So she teams up with TK, who's a prison psychologist who's been seeing Bill Kadiyama, and together they begin to investigate this 17-year-old case. It's not a cold case because Bill's obviously in prison for the murders, but they do recognize that there are some question marks and that it was a hasty investigation. It does raise questions of morality versus ethics, but also there's a whole bunch of questions about things like if someone did commit a crime, but the investigation was hurried or there was some sort of racial bias, should they still be in prison? So there's a whole bunch of questions about the ethics of the legal system as well. As you can see, I'm still refining my pitch, being on day 3 of the tour. But yeah, it's a fun book in a sense, but also deals with some pretty serious subject matter.
I absolutely love the premise of this novel, and I want to talk a little bit later about morality versus ethics in the context of Sloane's investigation. But I wondered, JP, if you could share with us where the idea for writing this novel first came from.
I was always fascinated by the Bain murders in New Zealand, which is a really famous case of wrongful conviction in which many, many people in New Zealand still believe David Bain murdered his family. And I was fascinated because, I'd say the very first time I thought about this story, a friend had actually told me about his brother, and his brother was a teacher and he had this kid in his class. And so he'd met the kid's mother at parent-teacher interviews, but the mother had a new partner. And so one time when parent-teacher interviews came around, this new partner came with the kid and he introduced himself and said, "Hi, I'm Mark." And my friend's brother, who's the teacher, said, "No, you're not. You're David Bain." And so he changed his name, obviously, and had done everything he could to escape the kind of prejudices that the public hold against him because many people, as I said, still believe he did it. His conviction was overturned, but there are a lot of question marks that remain around that case. And so I just thought, how could you live in a society in which everyone still believes you're guilty, what would freedom really look like? The rumors are he now lives in Perth, which is a little bit further away, but he's very distinct looking. He's quite a tall man with quite large ears. It's really easy to identify him. So I think that was actually really when I began to think more deeply about what it means to escape a criminal conviction. And also, I was thinking a lot about money and how much it costs to house prisoners, but also how much people are paid, millions often, if a conviction is overturned after a long enough period of time. We're talking millions of dollars. So, yeah, lots of stuff there, but that's probably where the idea originated from.
For me, when reading the novel, it was hard not to think of the Innocence Project and efforts internationally by various organisations committed to proving the innocence of people who've been wrongly incarcerated. So I wondered if
Yeah.
this was something that you delved into before starting to write this book, or did you learn more once the idea became more embedded in your mind?
Learned more as time went on for sure. I research after the fact. I tend to write and then go and fact check. One thing that happens when you research heavily, I think it's really obvious when a writer's done this. Well, one, it's a form of procrastination, I'd say also. So you research really heavily and then you become addicted to researching and you think, I won't start until I fully understand the subject, and then you get bogged down with it. Something else that happens when you research heavily is everything you learn, you find so interesting. And so you think it has to get into the book. And so it's just crammed with pieces of information that are much more interesting to you than the reader. And I think it can cause the story to sag a little bit. So I tend to research as fact checking. And so it wasn't probably till I had a first draft that I looked into things a bit more. When I say that, I already knew a great deal. I became really obsessed with the Amanda Knox case years ago, and likewise the David Bain case and the Tina Polder case. And that wasn't thinking about writing about any of these. That was just me having a general curiosity about these horrible crimes and how these people became entangled in the criminal justice system. And through the process of doing this research via fact checking, I got in contact with Michael Bennett, who's another author, who actually was the chief advocate for Tina Polder. That's a very famous case in New Zealand, but probably less so in Australia. I got in touch with him, and the problem is he was writing a book about someone who was potentially wrongfully convicted, and so I thought we both agreed that it could have contaminated the process for both of us. So we sort of drew a line through that. But I actually got in touch with Amanda Knox directly, and she pointed out some really great resources to help me understand the prevalence, but also the process of trying to have a conviction overturned, certainly in the States, but around the world, it's a real issue. So that's sort of what the research looked like for this book. It was almost retrospective just to make sure it worked. And then I found all the stuff that I would have put in the book. I would have been subject to my own interest, and I honestly think it probably would have been a worse book. But since, even since publication, I've read about other cases and other instances of wrongful conviction or potential wrongful conviction, and it still fascinates me. So I'm grateful that I've got the book out because I could have spent another 5 years writing it, and I don't know if it would have been any better.
I mentioned to you before we started recording that Hachette have actually provided me with an exclusive audio excerpt. And at this point, I'd like to play that excerpt. And I think what it does is it gives us a really great summary of the kinds of problems that Bill and his team faced at the time of his arrest and later trial, problems which Sloane and Bill's friend and psychologist TK Phillips that you mentioned earlier, problems that they have to grapple with in attempting to reinvestigate his case 17 years later.
Humiliation. That was one motivation offered by the prosecution. The shame of rejection drove Bill to stab each member of the Primrose family with his chef's knife. Or wrath. He did it in a fit of rage because Simon and Gwen Primrose fired him and withheld his final paycheck. Lust. Bill's infatuation with their teenage daughter grew to an obsession. He'd sent her lewd notes and couldn't live knowing he would never have her. Or a sort of psychosis. Bill was drunk, unstable. Endless possible motives. That's what the prosecution had. And circumstantial evidence for every one of them. But if you believe Bill's version of events, he simply found the bodies, heard the sirens and panicked, fleeing from the crime scene, wrong place, wrong time. I spent 3 years of my life trying to figure out what really happened and concluded that 2 facts should have created reasonable doubt. 1. Bill Kadiyama had experienced lifelong severe asthma. 2. Bill Kadiyama did not have an inhaler on the night of the murders. But the jury did not agree. When he was on trial, they decided the second fact was a lie, or seemed to believe a young man with severe asthma was capable of running 3 kilometers in 12 minutes without an inhaler. It's true that Bill did not do himself any favors the morning of the murders. At approximately 6 a.m., he walked 900 meters from his flat, past the Pope Sports Bar, past the strip of shops and the service station, to the Morning Star Bakery on the corner of Pope Terrace. As he made his way there, he placed a shopping bag full of ashes into the skip beside the BP. The ashes were once the clothes he'd worn the night before when he was at the Primrose house. At the bakery, he sat and ate a mince and cheese pie, staring out into the quiet street. It also didn't help that he'd cut his nails to the quick, shaved his head, bleach cleaned the flat he'd recently started renting, and destroyed his mobile phone. These acts alone do not make him a murderer, but they sure as shit didn't help his defense. Because most people don't really understand what trauma, fatigue, and drug-induced chemical imbalances in the brain can do to someone's behavior. Behaving strangely after exposure to death and extreme violence should not automatically get a man locked up for 25 years. There were other issues with the original trial, too. And if Bill ever got his retrial, it's likely he'd win for a number of reasons. First, the question of procedural fairness and sub judice. Second, the police failed to consider, let alone investigate, any other potential suspects. Third, the coercive interview techniques used on Bill. But there would be no retrial. Today I read that he's now been in prison for 17 years. It was reported in the Sunday paper, his face on page 3, a recent shot from inside. It sucker punched me, and for a moment, I was back there, meeting Bill. The first thing I noticed about him that day was his size. The photos in the press didn't seem to capture it. He was big, but lean. The second thing I noticed about Bill Kadiyama was his unusual calmness. As I drive from my parents' place in Rotorua back home to Auckland, I feel the pull of Cambridge. Just like before. Can't shake it. So I take the familiar turn-off and head out toward the house. I park outside a pair of iron gates set within a stone wall bordering the property, the sort you might find in the British countryside. I get out and approach the gates and feel a funny sort of nostalgia as I look through. I hadn't exactly forgotten, but it had been a while.
Bill Kadiyama was an intriguing character and one who all but confessed to the crime he was accused of committing. And as mentioned in that excerpt, there was some physical evidence linking him to the scene of the crime. There was eyewitness testimony placing him there. And to his detriment, Bill made some statements to the police at the time, which they took to be further evidence of his guilt. Even those that were closest to him were convinced of his guilt, weren't they?
I mean, that's really how it goes. When you look at most wrongful convictions, there are a few sort of trademarks of, well, one often being a hasty investigation or often a hasty kind of identification of the chief suspects. With Bill, you know, he confesses really in a way, in a sense, but it's misinterpreted. And also a interview under duress, certain interview techniques, it's well documented, often will cause false confessions and things like that. So there's a lot of question marks here about the investigation and those early interviews. Yeah, he has family and friends who can't really vouch for him, and that's always a red flag for police. He doesn't have a clear alibi. So there's a whole host of, as I said, kind of the trademarks of wrongful conviction. There's also a media element, and maybe it's not so much on the page, but that's pretty common for the media to also apply a great deal of pressure to the police. If it's a high profile case, the police really want a conviction, they want an arrest, they want things to happen quickly. Bill, whether or not he did it, and you'll have to read the book to find out, but there are characters in this book who are convinced he did it. And there are characters who aren't convinced that he didn't do it, but are kind of open-minded to it. And that tends to be how it goes. And that's why even when you have a conviction overturned, you're marked by it for a long time, because we have this sort of bias where if there's smoke, there's fire, and people who don't fully understand the ins and outs of a case. And it's hard because you don't speak the same language as lawyers and as the justice system. We really aren't trained to decode the language. We know guilty and not guilty. We know certain things and what they signify, but we don't really fully understand everything about the legal justice system. It's pretty impenetrable sometimes, the language they use. There's often cases where, like at the O.J. Simpson case, I'm convinced he did it, So then there's often cases where even if someone's proven to be not guilty, there is a general assumption that they did something. And again, like the Bruce Lerman case, even that in a civil setting, he's guilty, right? So now, but in a criminal court, he's not. So he is actually, we can legally say he is a rapist, but of course he's not convicted in a criminal court. So he didn't go to jail. So there's so much stuff here that's really you'd be forgiven for just giving up and assuming if someone was charged and did go to jail, even if they're released, it could have been a technicality. So Bill's been through all of this and he's in prison, but the one thing the one leg he's got to stand on is he's never once acknowledged his guilt. Outside of, as I said, there's some murky kind of confessions, and his lawyers weren't great, but they didn't really debunk any of this kind of stuff that the police did, or undermine in a legal sense any of the stuff that they did, or provide enough doubt. So he's been rung through the legal system. It was just about trying to find the perfect storm for a potential wrongful conviction, and he ticks most of the boxes.
I think the one thing that is going for him is that he continues to protest his innocence despite all of that murkiness that happened around his arrest and his trial. And I think the point that you've made is that, but for the fact that he continued to protest his innocence, he would have been eligible for parole. And that's a pretty powerful statement right there.
It's important for him that if he gets out, that people believe him. That's as important as his friend, more important than his friend, because he could be out if he had acknowledged his guilt. And then for the rest of his life, everyone would assume he's guilty. And that's really common, by the way. Lots of people in prison, as a criteria for parole, they have to acknowledge their guilt, which is really tricky if you aren't guilty, of course. That's one thing going for him. But the problem is it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to launch an appeal, a successful appeal anyway, unless you've got pro bono lawyers, which the Innocence Project can help with. And that's not, by the way, they don't actually really operate in Australia and New Zealand. They've handled fewer than 5 cases, I think, in Australasia. So yeah, unless you've got pro bono lawyers and some sort of funding from somewhere to pay for crime scene experts, blood spatter experts, psychologists potentially, people who can actually help to find reasonable doubt. Unless you can fund all this, you've got no chance of getting out. If you can't get competent lawyers to begin with, you just can't launch a successful appeal. So he's got nothing going for him because he doesn't really have any of this until he has Sloane and until TK is back on board. And then suddenly they start to ask some questions.
Indeed. Now, speaking of Sloane, she was quite critical of the lack of procedural fairness offered to Bill in both the investigation and in the trial. And this was something that she was quite determined to rectify, even if it meant his conviction would stand, right?
Yes. I love Sloane as a character for this reason. She's very principled in an industry where everyone risks exploiting those who've suffered the most. And I'm talking about the victims and the victims' families. So it can be pretty exploitative, true crime. She has a strong sense of principles and morality, and she's really committed to the idea of a fair and right justice system. She has to kind of reckon with the fact that at some stages she's got swings from considering it possible that he's innocent to being certain that he's guilty. And at the same time, she's having to reckon with the fact that if he is guilty, but he didn't get a fair trial, should he still be in prison? So, and if the investigation was flawed, but she still believes he's guilty, should he still be in prison? So there's lots of questions like that this book asks. And I think she's probably the character readers will most identify with and follow most closely for this reason, because I want readers also to inhabit her in a way that they are asking themselves, what would I do? How would I feel? Is this right or wrong as well?
As an ex-lawyer myself, something that Sloane said in the novel piqued my interest. So Sloane was talking to Bill's ex-lawyer, Laurie, about his conviction, and there was some discussion around morally acceptable behaviour versus what is ethical from a legal standpoint. And this is something that you alluded to a little bit earlier. Things a lawyer learns in the conduct of a criminal defence case, which must remain protected by legal professional privilege. And they discuss a well-known legal precedent established by the case known as the Buried Bodies case. I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about this and why it was important to the story and to Sloane's role in particular.
You know, I hate talking to lawyers or ex-lawyers because I'm going to mention Jock Strong twice here. Jock Strong has a rule. He says 5% of people who read it will know more about it than you, and you can't write for them because you can't have a level of exactitude required to satisfy everything that they know about this particular subject. So when I think about lawyers in this book, that's what I think. I'm like, you know, because they'll know the legal system. They know all these cases I talk about and things much more probably than I do, and jurisprudence and legal ethics and these sorts of things. But the other thing I'd say about Jock Strong is I once had an argument about the death penalty with him, and he just destroyed me. And that's what lawyers do. They also are really good at arguing and often have a really good really good points and have that kind of perspective. Certainly ethics and morality that I tried to kind of understand really, you know, when I was writing this. But the Buried Bodies case, which really fascinated me, it's kind of informed how many lawyers, and certainly in the United States, view client-attorney privilege. What happened was there were two lawyers, and they were representing a man who had been arrested and charged with murder. Two lawyers interviewing this man. He'd killed someone, tied them to a tree and stabbed them from memory. And then he'd tried to attack three other hikers in this park. And the hikers identified him. There was no way he was getting off. Like it was, the lawyers could try, but it was pretty open and shut. But he told them that he had murdered two other women, young women, and these young women had been missing. And the families had been searching for these young women. And these lawyers had actually helped in some of those searches. And the whole community were trying to find these two young women who'd been missing. And he told the lawyers, yes, I killed these young women. This is where they're buried. Now, this is where it gets a little bit murky. The lawyers went and viewed the bodies. At this point, they had to make a decision of whether or not they tell anyone. And I mean, they had the potential to call it in anonymously. And there's all sorts of questions about whether or not they should have viewed the bodies. I think the obvious answer is no, because their client attorney privilege, this was really tested, obviously. And I can imagine, like, you know, you put yourself in their shoes, you realize you've messed up when you see those bodies. It must have been horrible for them having to, one, they knew the girls. So that alone would have been just deeply traumatic. But two, the families continued to search and sort of rally the community, all the while they knew where the bodies were. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here, but it boils down to these two men making a decision not to report it. And during the trial, which this part's really interesting to me as well, it was a slip of the tongue, more or less, that caused this to sort of come out in the trial. And so suddenly the community and court knew that these men had kept this quiet, and they were pariahs, really. I think one quit the business. He stopped being a lawyer. One had to try to set up a legal practice again, and never really escaped. His reputation was destroyed. So their lives were ruined by this, and the community hated them. They lost all their friends, and then it brought about closure, you know, for the families, I suppose. But off the back of this, legal scholars, and I guess every lawyer probably had an opinion on it, but they debated the ethics of this, and they debated endlessly, I think, whether or not it was wrong for them to keep this a secret. And in the end, the answer was it was ethically correct. And as you said, it's formed a legal precedent around client attorney privilege. Whether or not it was morally correct, that's what fascinates me most about this, because he's going to prison anyway. He was obviously, a very horrible man and a murderer, and he's someone we don't want to be free in society. So everything else, is pretty clear in my mind, but the ethical side of it, it's really hard for me, a non-lawyer, to accept that. I guess it made clear how black and white legal ethics can be, and also where the paths kind of diverge between ethics and morality. In most other environments and in most other kind of circumstances in life, our ethics are entirely informed by a sense of morality, but this is one of those cases that doesn't seem to be true.
To be fair, I think Sloane gave Laurie what for in a really robust way when they were discussing it.
Laurie is very much, a certain kind of lawyer. He reminds me of many lawyers I know, and a few of my friends' dads are a bit like him, I think one of the descriptions is seeing many long lunches. I think he's a pretty likable character, and I think Sloane, in real life, in this book, his representation is probably less favorable, but in real life, you'd quite like him, I think. And Sloane does. So Sloane quite likes him at first, but she also sort of recognizes he's a certain type of man with a certain type of view of the world that's at odds with how she sees things. So there's definitely an element of the old versus the new school, I think, here as well. Jock Sarong, I mentioned earlier, he's a good mate of mine. He's an author and a former lawyer, but when he talks about his life as a lawyer, he did a lot of pro bono work and work for Indigenous causes and things. And so he's such an ethical guy. And I always think about him as a lawyer and imagine him. And the opening of his first book is basically an FU to the legal system in a way. And it's an ex-lawyer who's sort of arguing with a judge. But he sort of represents the kind of new school, I guess. And Laurie's much more old school in his views of the world and the legal system.
JP, there was so much complexity in this story, and there were a couple of other important themes that you explored, such as racism, class divide, and also determining someone's guilt based on how they look or their social circumstances, things that made the justice system blind to the inconsistencies in the evidence surrounding the Primrose murders. Now, Bill was of mixed heritage, although he identified as Maori. He was, as you said, he was working class, and by contrast, the Primrose family were white and rather well-to-do. I think it was fair to say that it was easy for the community to accept that he was responsible for the murders, both from the Maoris and also the Pahika, if that's the way you say it.
Pahika, yeah.
Yeah. And this was something that Sloane grapples with too, isn't it?
Yeah, Sloane has blind spots that become quite obvious as you read through the book. As likable as she is, she also represents a certain class and type of woman / feminist. So she's, like I said, I love her and I'd love to have a couple of Chardonnays with her, but she's flawed. And one of her flaws is, these blind spots about settling around race and representation in true crime. Bill's race is certainly a factor, although it's probably not as clear on the page to those outside of New Zealand, but there is enormous overrepresentation of Māori men in the justice system and prisons, but also percentage-wise, conviction levels, Māori men convicted at a much higher rate than Pākehā and other ethnicities. So, yes, there's quite a bit to unpack there. We do that via Sloane, but that's the same with Australia as well. There's parallels with name any country on the planet, and you'll find Indigenous representation in prisons much higher, Indigenous levels of incarceration much higher, and Indigenous levels of successful convictions. And part of that's just money. So to say it's entirely, a racist-based system is true, but there's also the effect of money if you can afford good lawyers. So it's a class thing as well, right? As with many race issues, at the core of it, when you really, dig down, you'll find class as a major factor. The other thing with the prison population and Māori numbers in prison, purely given percentages, they're also subject to higher rates of wrongful conviction. When you go to select a jury, lawyers can make exclusions. They can say, I don't want this person on the jury for any reason, really. But more often than not, it's based on race and sex. So women on certain cases are more likely to get a conviction than men, and so on and so forth. And in Australia, often for a trial with an Indigenous defendant, you'll find that there's not a single Indigenous member of the jury. And that is important. That is a factor. And so there's a whole lot of stuff at work here, but the odds were just always stacked against Bill. And again, he may be guilty. You have to read the book. So it's not necessarily about whether or not he did it. It's much more about the system when I'm talking about these things. Although Bill's race is a factor, I think I had as much to say about class as I did race.
As you rightly pointed out, we have very similar issues here in Australia. And while I was reading it, I thought this story could as easily have been set in Australia as it was in New Zealand. So why was setting it in New Zealand important to you?
Oh, I'm just lazy. That's the short answer. It was easy to write about a place I knew. So like I write, because so much of the story set 17 years later, I lived in New Zealand up until 2007. And so it's set in 2007 for that reason. It's my strongest, most recent memories of the place, certainly of living there. I visit a lot. I just called upon my own memories of what it was like in 2007. I was listening to that music. I was imagining that world. So it was partly it's lazy, but partly because I mean, this is also just laziness, the fact that I'm much more familiar with the class and race issues New Zealand has faced. So it's just me going to what I know, calling upon my own experiences and things like that, as opposed to having to invent everything from scratch. This is an absolute pipe dream and a lotto ticket and that sort of thing. But I'd love to see it adapted and set in New Zealand, but I'd also love to see it adapted and set in the States. This is a story that I think would resonate with all readers and viewers and listeners because it's really universal. And as much as I love the setting, I really love Cambridge. There are analogous towns and cultures in a way, certainly the culture of having a private chef and being blind to, their life and their heritage and their culture and treating them a certain way. That's not unique to New Zealand. In fact, there's many more private chefs in the US, much more higher, I guess, rate of employing staff in certain states and certain cities and towns in the States. And I'd even say that's true of Australia. Setting, as important as it was for me, and as much as I can control the creative process of this story, which I did, I wanted to set in New Zealand. I can imagine this being set anywhere, and I hope readers, wherever they are in the world, they can see their own world and their own kind of issues reflected in this story.
Talking about adaptations, and I don't necessarily believe that an adaptation of this book is a pipe dream because you've already had two works adapted for TV. In the Clearing was adapted for TV in a Disney Plus series. And I think The Last Guests has been adapted for TV.
Watching You, it's in pre-production, so I think they're supposed to start principal photography later this year. I'm busy, so I don't know everything, but I know that will be likely released next year.
Yeah. Have you had any involvement in the productions at all in terms of script writing or being in the writing room?
I've always had an interest in it. I don't think they want me. I think the reputation of novelists, in writers' rooms is it's their baby, right? Like you're watching your kid get a tattoo sort of thing. You want some distance. You don't want to be, that's a bad analogy, by the way, because I would probably do that. But you're watching this beautiful thing you made be cut up, torn to shreds. And I think you want honesty from a team of writers working on something. You don't want them kind of trying to appease this baby in the room. So I think it's good. I've never been that involved. I'm always at some level. I've always had some creative input. In the really early phases, they'll often interview you and try to mine you for more material and that sort of thing. And I was an extra, but I got cut. My wife said I was overacting. We were all in it. And when we went to the premiere, the scene we're in, we were sort of leaning one way, then the other, trying to get the camera to move so you could see us in the shot. Closest we got was these sort of amorphous kind of, pixels in the background, these sort of blobs. So, yeah, fair enough. I would probably cut me too. But this time round with Watching You, I think it's being shot in New South Wales. I'm going to fly out and I'm going to impose myself and be a real prima donna and make sure that I want to be there in the cutting room, the final cut. I want to say, no, leave that guy in. He's a star. I've never been formally involved in the writing process, but there are opportunities coming up for me to be a bit closer to certain projects. So maybe I'll be a bit more present, and it's always a timing thing as well, touring or writing or having a break or whatever. So the stars have to align for me to actually be any more involved than I've been. So we'll see.
Speaking of future projects, and you mentioned another novel coming out in another 18 months.
Yeah, I'm writing it. I probably know more about it than I do this 7 years later, to be honest. I'll just give you the premise. A woman drives, set in the States, a woman drives 160 miles from her hometown, which is a small kind of Midwestern town. It's like an Amish settlement on the fringe of town. It's really small and wholesome, and she's got no signs of any kind of mental stress or no indication that she's in any way a violent person, but she drives 160 miles to a city and there's a rally happening, and she drives her car and tries to hit the people but doesn't really succeed and gets out and starts firing indiscriminately in the crowd with a gun, and then she's shot and killed, and that's the start of the novel. Vince Reed, so Reed, who was a character from The Wrong Woman, he's coming back. He's hired by the family of one of the people that was hit, and only one person died. It was a young person at the young woman at the rally was hit by one of the shots, and she died. And the family have contacted Reed to figure out why, because they don't accept the police explanation that it was a mental break. The police found nothing that suggested a political motivation or terrorist motivation or anything at all. They just called it a random act, and the family just can't accept their daughter was killed by a random act. So they hire him, and he goes and begins to investigate. He realizes very quickly that there's a couple of things that just don't quite make sense. At the same time, acknowledges and recognizes that the police, why would they investigate any further than they need to? They know who did it. She's killed. That's the closest thing to justice anyone's going to get. There's no incentive for them to pursue the matter any further. They sort of close the case. They speak to the husband and investigate as much as they can, but really there's no incentive to go as deep as Vince Reed's prepared to go. So Reed just, he does what he does, and he gets stuck in. And obviously it's a crime novel, so the police, it turns out, probably closed the case a little too quickly, and he finds out a whole bunch of stuff. And yeah, it's fun. I like it as a story. It's I like the setup and the premise, and I love it. I love the fact that I get to follow Reed around again, because I think The Wrong Woman was one of my favorites of mine, and he's just such a cool character. So I'm back with him.
Fantastic. Well, we need Sloane and Reed together in a novel at some point.
There's a lot of chat about that with my publisher, actually, but I can't see it happening. I want to bring Sloane back. I think she's great as well. I've never written a returning character, so I'm probably getting ahead of myself saying I'm doing two, but we'll see. I always have my little characters popping in and out of each other's stories in a way, so maybe there's room for Sloane in the future for sure.
On a final note, and with the benefit of so much experience under your belt now, I wondered if you had any tips for aspiring authors who might be listening to this podcast today.
I said this the other day. Just, this is the anti-tip, because you've been told a million times to have an author website and Instagram and all this stuff. It's just so simple. It's a miracle that you've probably never been told this. Write a good book. That's the most important thing you can do, is write the best book you can. And you might think you've done that, but I promise you haven't. And the more time you spend writing, the better it'll get. And the more time you work on your craft, the better you'll get. And that's a million times more important than having an author website or Facebook page or Instagram or whatever. But if you love to do those things, sure, do them. Like if you love Instagram and you're effective at building an audience and a brand, you can do that. But it shouldn't, if it's going to cost you any time on the novel, if it means the novel's going to be even 1% worse, it's probably not worth it. Unless you're, Sally Hepworth, then by all means, you could write a bad book. She's never written a bad book, by the way, but you could probably write a bad book and still have it published. But the chances are you're more likely to be a better writer than you are to be an influencer. And I'd say if anyone's ever told you you'll never get published without an author page or whatever, it's simply not true. If you write a really good book, If you write the best book you can, if your publisher's passionate about it and likes it, you're going to have time to build all that stuff up later. Just sit down and do the work and write the absolute best book you can. Don't beat yourself up if it doesn't come naturally. I don't do much on social media and it seems to be working okay. So yeah, just focus, just write a good book. I should add, if you've got 1 million followers, leverage that.
JP, I absolutely loved 17 Years Later. It was a compelling, gripping read for crime lovers the world over. I wish you every success with it. And thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
It's been an absolute delight and a good way to spend my morning. So thanks for having me back on.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.